He went himself, and he checked out the river. Eyewitness, you know? Here's Geraldo Rivera on the spot, at a campsite, on this river. What are you finding? You know, he's got a beard, he's got whiskers, and there's some mosquitoes, but he's right there, and he's going to tell you, I've been all over this river for the last few weeks. That's how the word is used, of somebody who's at the right time, right place, gathering data. Isn't it interesting that Paul chose that word? I'm in Jerusalem at +5, gathering data. What's the theme of the book? The gospel, from Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. How do you get +5? That would be real helpful. I could tell my friends that. Just tell me how you get +5. Remember, Paul's an authoritative witness, according to critics, and he gives us the timeline. Here's Paul. When was Paul converted? Some people say as early as +1, +2, +3. Nice average would be he's converted 2 or 3 years after the cross. That's when he sees Jesus. So, Paul's converted, +2, +3. And he says, I went up to Jerusalem 3 years later. So I think Paul was converted at +1. Good. He's in Jerusalem +4. Oh, no, Paul wasn't converted till +3. Good. +6. You get my point? We're about +5. This is really, really early. And Paul's there getting this data. Hysteresi. I was checking this stuff out myself. And don't forget, he says, I saw Jesus myself. I'm just asking them what they saw. Now, as Galatians 1 ends, and in the originals, you know, there's no chapter divisions there, he goes right into Galatians 2. And he says, 14 years later, I went back to Jerusalem. This is usually dated by critical scholars, about 48 AD. And Paul said, Galatians 2:2, to me, is one of the most incredible verses in all of Scripture. It's really kind of odd. Galatians 2:2. I went back up there, and he went up there to see about those who wanted to spy out his liberty in Jesus. And he said, I want to check with them about this deal that some were rumoring that the apostles in Jerusalem were making people obey the law. I want to check it out. So I went up there. Galatians 2:2. I set before them the gospel I was preaching, King James. And it's very close to all the translations. Galatians 2:2. I set before them the gospel I was preaching to see if I was running or had run in vain. What? Yeah, I went up there and laid before them the gospel I was preaching to make sure we're on the same page. Paul, you've been preaching for 14 years or more, and you want to make sure you're all on the same page? You know who you're talking to. You're talking about the Old Testament professor, and he says, you're not following my argument. Frankly, you're just not listening. He says, follow my argument. This is Paul. Follow my argument. Jesus died. Jesus rose. I saw him. Step 1, I got it from Jesus himself. Do you have a better source? I didn't think so. Secondly, 3 years later, I got it from Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Do you have a better source than that? I didn't think so. You can almost hear him say, shut up. You know? He goes, and this is at least the 3rd time I've checked this out. Jesus, Peter and James, and some people think there's more times than this. This is at least the 3rd time. No, I didn't wait 14 years. But I went up there 14 years to make sure we're all on the same page. Oh, okay. So you're still doing the work of Histor? Yes. Wow. We don't have a model like that from anybody else in the New Testament who checks out the data and keeps checking it out. That's why Howard Clark Key says you can put it in a court of law and win a positive verdict. That's why Hans von Koppenhausen says it gives you everything an ancient text would want. But when he's here, guess who's listening and talking to him? Peter, just like earlier. James, the brother of Jesus, just like earlier. And John is there now, the big 4. You tell me one person in the early church who's more authoritative than these 4, not counting Jesus. Who's the most authoritative? Who's more authoritative? Who would you rather hear? You folks are coming this weekend to get a bunch of speakers under one roof. Would you come at least this far to hear Paul, Peter, John, and James, the brother of Jesus? Pretty cool, right? The leading witnesses, all of whom died as martyrs. You go, well, we've got to be pretty careful about that. That martyr stuff comes from early Christian traditions that are kind of late. Okay, all right. Peter, Paul, and James. We have first-century sources for each of their martyrdoms. John, evangelicals frequently believe John wasn't martyred. We have a second-century source for John's martyrdom. These guys put their money where their mouth was. You go, well, a lot of people die for their faith. Yeah, but let me tell you something. The disciples are in a position that nobody else is. Nobody. Why? Because no other founder of a world religion was raised from dead. You go, well, that's because you're a prejudiced Christian. No, ask them. There's an article on my website published in a secular peer-reviewed journal called Resurrection Claims in Non-Christian Religions. Check it out for yourself. I won't be able to go into detail. But no other founder of a major world religion is believed to have been raised from the dead. So the disciples claim to have witnessed something that's never been witnessed by a major founder of a major religion throughout the world. And what is it when you die for something? No matter what it is, you willingly die. It's virtually always conceded that you at least believed your message. You could be a loser. You could be wrong. I don't want to have to believe your message, but you believe your message if you die for your message. You believe it. And what did these guys die for? Well, the gospel's the center of their message, and the resurrection's the center of the gospel. They died for the truth of the resurrection appearances. And we have first century data for 3 of their 4 martyrdoms and a second century date for the last one. Now remember what we needed with George Washington? Right people, right time, right place, asking the right questions, getting the right data. Folks, look at verse 5 in Galatians 2. They heard my gospel, and they added nothing to me. Oh, we're all on the same page? We're adding nothing to you. You take the gospel to the Gentiles, I said, and Peter will take it to the Jews. Wow. We're all on the same page. Yes, we are. Don't forget the poor. They add later. Paul said the very thing I wanted to do. But he said regarding the gospel, we're all on the same page. That's fantastic. And in verse 9, they give he and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. That's where we get that phrase. They bless their work. Wow. So, Jesus did it. Paul saw him. He talks to Peter and James. He talks with Peter, James, and John, and they're all on the same page. Now, this is the disciples blessing Paul. If you want a good verse for Paul saying they're preaching the right thing too, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 11. Paul says, after reporting that the apostles were eyewitnesses of the resurrection appearances, Paul said, whether it is I or they, so we preach and so you believe. Here's what Paul's saying. I don't care if you take my word for it or if you ask Peter. If you see James, ask him. If you see John, ask him. We're all preaching the same thing. We saw the risen Jesus. Then they died. What does that mean? That means they were so sure they saw the risen Jesus they're willing to give their life. But guess what? They're the only ones in the universe who are in the right place. A few others. But they're the only ones in the universe to know if Jesus really appeared. And they died for it. What does that mean? They utterly believed it. If you don't believe the resurrection, you have issues. Because the data are good. They shared the message. Galatians 2:5. They added nothing to them. 1 Corinthians 15:11. Ask any of us. You're all preaching the same message. And here's an end note. But usually when I come to this conference, usually when I go to a lot of these type conferences, I speak on the topic of emotional doubt. Christians hurt. Some of you are here because you have questions. Just a footnote. Let's take these 4 guys. Paul, Peter, James, and John. Do you know that 3 of the 4 had serious issues? You say, well, I've got issues in my life. I'm not, I've made mistakes in the past. Okay. Paul killed people and thought he was doing God a favor. Peter, after saying he would never deny his Lord, did it and thought he wasn't fit to follow. James, the brother of Jesus, and we'll explain this afternoon, James, the brother of Jesus, was an unbeliever. As far as we know, that didn't change until he saw the risen Jesus. How'd you like to have been a fly on the wall when Jesus appeared to his brother? 1 Corinthians 15:7. And Jesus says, bro, it's me. Check it out. Only I don't think Jesus would be saying it like a joke. He'd say, bro, it's moi. We keep this between us. You're my brother. I love you. I'm raised from the dead. And James gets on board. 3 of the 4 had issues. Only John, as far as we know, doesn't have issues. How'd you like to go around going, I'm the disciple whom Jesus loved? That's pretty neat. But he's the only one without serious issues. And they're the 4 best top leaders. And they have this message. Okay, real quickly. Everything I've been saying gets us back to 35 AD. But we can get all the way back to the cross. He says, well, I think it's 33 AD. Fine. Then we can get back to 33 AD. Well, I think it's 30. Fine. We'll get back to 30. Whatever the date the cross is, we can get back there. How do you know? Okay, watch carefully. This is when Paul received the material. I delivered unto you that which I also received. If he got this material from James and Peter, they had it before he had it, right? It's easy. They gave it to Paul. They knew it before Paul knew it. Now, Paul knew Jesus was raised, but that may have been the first time he heard their testimonies about the appearances. Okay. Now, it takes a little while for a teaching to be converted into a da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You go, we write music pretty quickly today. Yeah, but for literate people. And then you put it up there. This takes a little while. Okay. Paul received it. They had it before Paul. It takes a while to standardize it. And whoops, we're right there. You say, well, this sounds like some evangelical hocus pocus. Okay, well then let me cite only liberals. The Jesus Seminar. How many of you know who the Jesus Seminar is? They reject 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus, depending on how you count. That's not conservative. And they say that this material that Paul is citing, at the latest, comes before Paul's conversion. Gerrit Ludemann, I don't know, I've never met the man, but I've heard him called an atheist German New Testament professor. Atheist. He says it's a maximum of +3. And the latest reports from 3 very prominent European scholars, one's an American, but he's the head of the department at Edinburgh University in Scotland, all 3 of them, Larry Hurtado, Richard Bauckham, they said that, here's their thesis, coming out of the gate in 30 AD, 2 doctrines had to be present or Christianity never would have gotten off the ground. Why? Because it's what Christians centrally proclaim. So if they don't proclaim it, they don't have the central message. What are those 2 doctrines? Larry Hurtado's written a huge, almost 500-page book called Lord Jesus Christ, and he argues that you have to have a high Christology coming out of the gates. Jesus didn't become the Son of God, you know, way down here, when people started calling him that. Hurtado says he's got to come out of the gates. You've got to have a high Christology. And because they're so intertwined, you have to have a resurrection. Of course, everybody dies. If you're raised, you died. So coming out of the gates, they had to proclaim a high Christology, death and resurrection right here. I was given this lecture in Cambridge a few years ago. And as I was giving the lecture, who walked into the room except Richard Bauckham? And I thought, great. He's checking me out. And I just happened, I'm going to quote this guy all the way through this lecture. And he's sitting back in the back, and it was a room was full of professors and PhD students at Cambridge. That's who it was.